Now, in addition to job discrimination, Mexican Americans also experienced racial discrimination in the streets, right? Police brutality. We'll take a look at a couple of examples of this in Los Angeles. So in the 1940s in Los Angeles, there was a particular style that was popular amongst the young people, right? They were known as pachucos, and pachucos wore zoot suits. You have a couple of examples down here. The zoot suit basically involved wearing like a large coat, right? You can see this coat's like, probably way too big for this guy, and also oversized pants, real big wide pants. Sometimes they'd have, the watch with the watch chain hanging down. Sometimes they may have a big flamboyant hat to go along with the zoot suit. And so this was the style of dress at the time, right? It was popular. They're young people. You know, young people always have their styles. And so that's how it was, right? For the Pachucos, that was their style of dress. They wore zoot suits, right? But the problem was local media outlets, particularly local newspapers in Los Angeles, were perpetuating racial stereotypes of Mexican Americans, right? They basically were making it seem like all Mexican Americans were criminals, that the Pachucos were gang members who were involved in drugs and in a crime wave that was going on at the time. An example of violence that did break out amongst young Mexican Americans during this time was the murder that took place at Sleepy Lagoon. Sleepy Lagoon was a reservoir outside of Los Angeles, and a lot of young Mexican American people would go and hang out there. All right. The reason why they're going to a reservoir outside of Los Angeles is because they couldn't go to the public pools in Los Angeles because of segregation. Okay, so they would go out to Sleepy Lagoon and hang out there. And there was a party there one night. A fight broke out, and one guy got killed. Okay, and so there was a big controversy over it. 600 Mexican Americans were arrested in relation to the murder at Sleepy Lagoon. And, not all 600 were prosecuted, but about 22 were prosecuted for that. So it was a mass trial for this murder. And several were found guilty of first-degree murder as well as second-degree murder. Some were found guilty of assault. And the trial was really kind of ridiculous because many of the defendants didn't have lawyers. They didn't have representation. And there was all kinds of biased testimony that was allowed on the record during the trial. And so the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee basically was made up of lawyers who were trying to fight for the rights of the defendants on the trial. They basically were able to successfully appeal the verdict, the guilty verdict, and all of the young people that were convicted were eventually let off and found not guilty because pretty much there was a lack of evidence that any of them had anything to do with the murder, and they didn't have proper representation at the time. Another example of racial discrimination in Los Angeles that was related to the Sleepy Lagoon murder case was the Zoot Suit riots. And so the Zoot Suit riots were basically attacks by military men, right, who were stationed in Los Angeles against the Mexican American community, particularly against Pachucos. One of the smaller issues that led to this was the fact that there was a ration at that time on suits made of wool. Okay, and so the Pachuco style of dress was using a lot of wool, right, because they're oversized clothes, and some people were angry about this, right, because that Pachucos basically were breaking the ration and were wearing these clothes. You had black market tailors who would who would create the suits for them. So that's one of the things which brought some anger towards the Pachucos. But really, it was the media that instigated the Zoot Suit riots. How so? Well, basically, they were perpetuating a number of stereotypes about the Pachucos, right? As I mentioned earlier, that they're gang members, that they're participating in this crime wave that was happening in Los Angeles at this time. So because of all this sensationalist journalism, you would have people in the community, particularly members of the military, going out and fighting Pachucos, right? It got to the point where you would have thousands of military personnel taking cabs into downtown Los Angeles and just wandering the streets looking for Mexican Americans, and they would fight them. Right? We can take a look at a couple of pictures of this. Here's a picture of some sailors and other servicemen walking around with clubs. I mean, imagine, thousands of people going out there ready to fight you, some of them with weapons. Pretty scary and dangerous. Here is a picture of some Mexican Americans that were injured as part of the riots. Not only would they be beaten, but they would tear off your clothes because they were tearing off the zoot suits, right? It was a whole thing, right? They're anti-zoot suit, right? So they're tearing off people's clothes. That's why you see this kid with no clothes on, looking at another kid who's badly beaten. Now, nobody was killed in the Zoot Suit riots, but it took days. This was happening for several days. And part of the reason why the riots kept continuing and why Mexican Americans were being beaten was because the local police weren't doing anything about it. Right? They were there, like you see a member of the police there in that last picture. They were there, but they were not trying to stop these members of the military from attacking Mexican Americans. All right, so there was a lack of a response. It was said that police officers were just standing there watching, some even laughing while this was happening. And then afterwards, a large number of Mexican Americans, many of them who were victims of violence, were arrested by the police. Right? Hundreds of Mexican Americans were arrested during this time of the Zoot Suit riots. Right? So definitely bias on the part of local police during this time. Eventually, it would take the military to stop the riots. The military's banned all of its personnel from going into Los Angeles, and military police were sent out to patrol the streets, and that's what brought an end to the riots. The Los Angeles City Council also responded in a discriminatory way to the riots. They basically criminalized Mexican Americans, saying that the Pachucos and the Zoot Suiters were vagrants and that they could be arrested, and also they made zoot suits illegal. Okay, so particular legislation outlawing the wearing of zoot suits during this time. Right, so definitely, you see discrimination in the city council, the police, and the media was the one who really instigated the riots in the first place.